Okay, so I want to start with a little interaction, get you guys thinking. What have you taken away from the past few weeks? I like how Don tends to start the class. We kind of try to look back and remember what we've been talking about. So anything that stuck with you at all, or maybe another way to get at it is to ask, what would you say is the point of the book of Proverbs? We've been looking at that book now for a few weeks, maybe two or three. Jesus, thank you for the Sunday school obvious answer. What would you say is the point of it? I mean, is it, who knows how long it is off the top of your head? It's just a trivial question, but anybody know? 31 chapters. So there's a lot to it. Okay. Yeah, good. I mean, you think of Proverbs, probably it's one of the first words you think of is wisdom. And what's the phrase? I just erased it. It was probably up there a few times from last week. But what was the phrase that Solomon keeps linking to wisdom? Do you remember? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And he says other things like that. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord leads to understanding. He has different ways of saying it. But he's talking about the fear of the Lord. And so for probably 2 weeks, right, Don, we've talked about that as a central foundational idea. And we've talked about the tendency we all have, all of us humans have. And I would say even probably, not probably, I would say it's a safe bet that Solomon had that in his life. Even as I'm thinking about that, we can just say 100% certainty. Yeah, he had it in his life. Yes and no. Okay. Uh, and probably, yeah, we all do as well. So there's this issue of wisdom. How do you even define that word? How would you define the word wisdom? Is that Laura? Truth. Okay. And remember, it doesn't have to, with words, they don't have to mean just one very narrow thing. There's kind of a range of meaning, and they overlap with other terms. Not like either or always, but yeah, yeah. An alignment to truth. Good. Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't know. Yeah. And literally a heart that hears. Literally, we're going to look at that. Okay. It's interesting. A heart that hears, a heart that understands, which again go hand in hand, those ideas. That's why you have different translations of it. So, I mean, what else comes to your mind? It could be a biblical idea definition, or it could be just even a worldly, just kind of everyday definition. I don't know, wisdom. What to make you think of? Okay, and we've talked about that for a few weeks, and hopefully that's sinking in that we're really trying to reinforce this idea that to really grasp what God says wisdom is, how he defines wisdom, is to maintain a unbreakable connection to the person of God and the character of God and the person specifically of Christ. And again, as we finish today, hopefully, if we get all the way through it, we'll come and look at some of the New Testament about wisdom embodied in Christ. So we've been stressing that and see that as central, super important to not detach wisdom, whether that be just little principles. Although Proverbs is filled with principles, but to see the point that even Solomon circles back to over and over again is the fear of the Lord, the centrality of God, if this is our symbol representing God here. So, yeah, really important idea that we'll hopefully keep reiterating throughout this morning. Go ahead, Dave. Yeah, there's something to that. Like we like to categorize them. It's just part of our humanity. We like to, as we think, some are more detailed than others, but we all sort of categorize information. And so we think about God, his attributes. We can break it up into this whole long list. And you look at systematic theologies, and they have maybe a chapter on each attribute or whatever. And we can do that to try to get it down to our level, manage it, try to define God. But we keep highlighting, okay, there's a place for that, but coming back to the importance of seeing this is a person This isn't just data. Everybody's enamored with wisdom in our world to one degree or another. I heard a comedian talking about recently fortune cookies and how horrible they taste, and yet still we break them open and read the little thing, right, to see what's it say. You're going to find love this year or whatever, right? Uh, I don't know. There's something we're drawn to with that. It gives us a little, I don't know, hope or fortune in our lives, and we could look at the Proverbs that way. I'm convinced that in times in my life in the past, especially, although I'm sure there's still some degree to which I can fall prey to this, but there was a tendency to say, okay, I've tried the pagan fantasy, that didn't really work out, so let me try now a little more religious fantasy. And I don't think it was a conscious decision, but moving into a Christian environment, a moral environment, there's a whole new set of enticing idols, a whole new set of little shiny things to strive after in a new context, but it's still things in this world. And I think it's easy to use the Proverbs even to aim at those things, which once again relates to failing to see the whole point. So when you look at Proverbs, look at Proverbs 1 for a minute. Go ahead. Yep. Yeah, is that even the fortune cookie idea? Like that, why are we drawn to those things? It is something, maybe it's dangling something before me. I think it's always positive, right? I mean, you ever get a negative fortune? You're gonna get cancer this year? I don't remember seeing anything like that. Like it's kind of dangling something appealing. So yeah, I'm wondering now. Let's do this. So maybe these ideas can continue to gel and come together. Let's look at Solomon's life a little bit. I think we see some things illustrated in his life that help us highlight the Christ connection here. How God really sends wisdom in personified form through Christ. So yeah, maybe it'll help. Let's go there, and then we'll keep talking about that, because there is a vertical and a horizontal dimension to this. So let's look at his life, and I think some of this, for me, the last couple days as I've studied this, it's been blowing me away, and just seeing this amazing display. Once again, just shining the spotlight on Jesus in some powerful, powerful ways. So let's look through it. Okay, so you notice even the way he comes at wisdom. It's just interesting. He doesn't even start with, I mean, Proverbs 1:1 is not the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I mean, he starts with to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, equity. I mean, a lot of those things have a strongly horizontal tone to them, right? So I think Solomon in his head, he's saying, hey, there's a pursuit. And even throughout the Proverbs, he talks about how valuable wisdom is. And he says, like fine gold, it's like treasure that you find. And it's, makes it does. He talks about your life will go well. And he talks about, he pleads with his son, listen to me, listen to your father, listen to what I'm saying, that your life might go well. So the way Solomon's viewing it, he's viewing it this way. Then he comes to the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. He's kind of coming back to this. I noticed a couple points where he starts with this, and then he talks about the fear of the Lord. Then he comes back to the wisdom again in a practical way. And so I was just thinking through that and thinking about his life, his biography. What do we know about this guy? And some pretty cool things connected in my mind. So hopefully it's helpful as we try to make sense of this, as we try to make sense of the horizontal and the vertical. So go back to 2 Samuel, okay? Second Samuel, and while we're turning to chapter 12 in 2 Samuel, tell me who is Solomon's mom? Who remembers? Bathsheba. That's right. And was Bathsheba David's first wife? Was it a nice storybook, Christian Tingle type of relationship? No. Back earlier, so we're going to look at chapter 12, but if you go to chapter 5, it says that David multiplied for himself wives and concubines. So before even the Bathsheba incident, David had already amassed a number of women in his life. Okay, so this is not some great pure story of one man, one woman, not even holding hands till their wedding night or whatever that was. Okay, so David commits adultery with Bathsheba. They conceive a child. This is all context. We're going to look at the passage in a minute. But for context, David commits adultery, has Uriah killed. They conceive a child, and what happens to that child? Child dies. Then when Bathsheba is mourning, now we look at 2 Samuel 12, verse 24. It says, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and he named him Solomon. Now the Lord loved him and sent word through Nathan the prophet, and he named him Jedediah for the Lord's sake." So right off the bat, we're seeing what we always talk about around here, which is flawed, sinful humans and a great God doing amazing things through flawed, sinful humans, and even using deliberate acts of sin to bring about good purposes, so that David's sin with Bathsheba leads to the birth of Solomon, whom God predicts and whom David knows will be the next king of Israel. Let's look at this. 2 Samuel 7. Back up. I know we're going a little bit weird. We're going to go in chronological order for the most part, but back up for a second. 2 Samuel 7. Before Solomon's born, there's this promise that David's not going to have this eternal, everlasting kingdom. And it appears to point to Solomon here. So 2 Samuel 7, 12 to 16. "When your days are complete, David, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever." In accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So there was the promise about the perpetuation of this kingdom through David's offspring, which seems to be pointing to Solomon, which later they come to understand is Solomon, not one of David's other children. He had many other children, including sons, and even sons who competed with Solomon for the throne. But you have this promise of God, which seems to point to Solomon, and yet, because, and we're gonna resist the urge to go here yet, but we know, because of our understanding of the whole context, that it's ultimately pointing to Christ, isn't it? Who will have an eternal kingdom. Although parts of it, when it says even God will chastise him and discipline him, certainly we could even argue that that relates to Christ, but in a different sense relates also to Solomon in a human, earthly sense. So you have this going on. You've got this dynamic of a kingdom, lowercase k, and a kingdom from God's perspective with a capital K. So you've got horizontal, historical things taking place, and you have a sovereign God orchestrating everything with a greater plan than even anyone realized. Now jump ahead to 1 Kings. 1 Kings 2. We'll look at the end of David's life here. 1 Kings 2, verse 1. Someone want to read verses 1 through 4 for me of 1 Kings 2? So is that conditional or unconditional language? Right there. That's conditional language. And David is charging his son, hey, here's the deal. Here's what you have to do that things may go well with you, that there may be this throne established. So David charges Solomon. Jump ahead now, 1 Kings 3, 3 through 9. And there's some conflict in between where there's this, I think it's Adonijah, I think, one of David's other sons is eager to take the throne, and there's this dispute, and I think even Bathsheba gets involved. And then 1 Kings 3, 3 through 9, I'll just read this section. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give to you." Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people, who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" And let's just read verse 10. It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon asked this thing. God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have you asked riches, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you." So we hear things that speak of some kind of Godward inclination in Solomon, right? I mean, language is there of that, right? And even when he's communicating with God, he says, "Hey, this is what I want from you. I want understanding." And God says, it says in the text there, it was pleasing, and God said, "I'm going to give that to you, Solomon. I'm going to give you wisdom, exceeding the wisdom of anyone else around you. You're the wisest man in the land." It says he loved, it explicitly says he loved the Lord. It's from the same word used when it says God loved him, that name Jedediah, beloved of the Lord, all has this idea of God loving Solomon, loving this household, loving this family, David's family. And here it says that Solomon loved him. But quickly he says, what? Verse 3. I want to read the end of that verse. Go ahead. Except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So I looked at that a little bit and just looking at the commentaries as far as the language part, and it's a little bit of debate about, okay, what exactly does that mean? Was it, there was no temple in place yet? But again, we don't have to just guess at this. We know Solomon's life. We know some things that played out. We'll look at a little of that. But was his heart single in its focus? Was his heart really purely in love with God? And perhaps did he not even himself know to what degree there was this Godward inclination, and to what degree there was a selfish inclination? Can we say that there was probably some of that simultaneously going on? I don't know. Yeah. 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 And you have the Donald's back there. You do have God intervening or intersecting over and over and over again with this family. Time will bear that out too, and time will reveal more clearly what's going on. but this is what is recorded here. This is what we see. So let's keep going. Yeah, so that's where I think where you're going is where it's going to go regardless. Like, because I think it's not like, when you look at that, it literally is debated that that little term there, that particle that's translated except, it could mean simply that as part of his devotion to God, he did this, whereas they didn't have a temple, they didn't have, I don't think even the tabernacle, they talked about historically, this is an odd time, so they would use high places to sacrifice to Jehovah, to Yahweh, even though, so there was possibility, but either way, that comes out indisputably. So yeah, it could be that, and that's why it's translated that way, and it is a huge deal. It's a huge deal. You're right. So that's a really important to highlight. It is a colossal deal. Yeah, go ahead. Well, we haven't got there yet, so sit tight. Yep. So actually, go to 1 Kings 6 now, and I don't think this is just some kind of coincidence. So 1 Kings 6, you remember there was this promise about building a house for the Lord, even though God says, I think at least once, if not twice, hey, I don't need a house. Everything's mine. You need a house. I don't need a house. But there's this idea that David has, and I think it was his idea initially, and then it's carried on, and God says, you're not going to be able to do it. Your son is going to do it. So there's going to be a house built. So look at this. 1 Kings 6:38. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished throughout all its parts and according to all its plans. So he, Solomon, was 7 years in building it. Now look at chapter 7, verse 1. Someone read that. And he finished all his house. Need a big house. Again, I don't think it's just coincidence that those verses are side by side with, there was no chapters and verses in those days. So it was all one flow. And he's just saying, okay, God's house, contrast Solomon's house, almost twice as long building his own house. Interesting tidbit, right? I think is indicative of what's going on there, which would be consistent with everything we know about human nature by itself. So let's keep going. That's just kind of one example, which I think is significant. That could perhaps be debated, but I think it's pretty significant. And it fits perfectly with how we understand human nature and selfishness. So now go to 1 Kings 11. And this is what David was starting to talk about. I'll just read because I don't know how far I'm going to go here. But starting in verse 1 of chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. He's eclectic in his love for women. Jill and I were talking about this last night. I mean, like I had a Bible college teacher, this little older guy, little quiet spoken, soft spoken. He actually had the voice of Piglet remember the Winnie the Pooh cartoon? Like literally sounded just like Piglet. Well, I remember him talking about King David and Bathsheba. What's that? It was distracting. He also clean his glasses in class. He had these big lenses, and he would take them out and stick the lens in his mouth and just lick it. Interesting guy. Anyway, a lot of great things we talked about in there, but those were some interesting, distracting attributes. Anyway, so he was talking about King David and Bathsheba. And he said, believe me, it was an honor to be laid by the king. And he would say these shocking things in his Piglet voice sometimes. And just last night, Jill and I were talking about that and said, hey, even if, say Uriah was like a complete dirtbag, and let's say to some degree, she was maybe even honored and enticed, she was being manipulated. She was being used. Like, that's the reality. It's not like Yeah, some people I think try to downplay it. Well, it's just, a cultural thing. Look, this is human selfishness. It is greed. It is objectification. It's all the horrible things people talk about today. It's all that. It's not some healthy relationship. So you see, that's part of what I guess we're trying to get at is, and I think I want to get there. So can you hold that thought, Dave? Because I want to see if we can bring this to like a really crystallized end here. Okay. Can you hold that for a second? You gonna lose it? Okay. Um, so, and then it says with these women, right? He just with them, he follows after all their gods of all these other nations, and he just plunges into all this. Okay. And there's more I can say, but I want to come to Ecclesiastes in a minute and look at his heart for a minute, get a glimpse at his heart. But for now, just note the facts. Okay. This is what happened. He's with all these women, 700 wives, 300 concubines. I did the math. He reigns for 40 years. If you even it out, even though I'm sure it didn't play out this way, 25 women per year. If you just do the math on that, even though again, I'm sure it was 50 in one year and less in another. But I mean, just crazy numbers. Okay. All right. So look at verse 9 of chapter 11. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. So God even met with him and said, don't do this. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And then he talks about what's going to happen, which is the divided kingdom. The kingdom is in shambles, really, from this point forward, even from just a human sense, okay? And then Solomon reigned 40 years. And if you look at chapter 11, verse 42, the end of the chapter there, it says he reigned 40 years and then he died. He slept like David. He died. And over the course of his life, there's another verse that says he wrote over 3,000 proverbs and 1,000 songs. So 40 years. We just read about some of the details of his life. We're acknowledging, okay, and what he wrote in Proverbs, and what we even see in Ecclesiastes, there's this wisdom, and he certainly had this wisdom. Do you remember the story about the queen of the south, Queen of Sheba? She comes, she's a Gentile queen. She hears of Solomon, and she comes, she has to meet him, and she has all these questions for him, and she brings presents and all this with her to see this man and his great wisdom. So he had wisdom in a very real sense. So now go to Ecclesiastes, okay? Psalms, Proverbs. It's Ecclesiastes next, right? Yeah. Ecclesiastes 2. Oh, sorry, chapter 1. Ecclesiastes 1. And beginning of the book, this gives us a little glimpse into Solomon's heart, and it helps us understand a little bit better, I think, how he experienced this wisdom, okay? So just bear with me here. So he begins with vanity of vanities, and vanity means what? What's that mean? You know what that word means? Yeah, emptiness, nothingness. Okay, he said nothingness, pointless, emptiness. Look at verse 12 down to verse 18. This is just amazing. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. So this is toward the end of his life. And I set my hand to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. And it is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realized that this also is striving after what? Wind. Because in much wisdom there is much what? Grief. And increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. So you take this, by itself for a minute. He had it. Horizontal. He knew stuff. People were impressed. Queen of Sheba comes to see him, blown away. Amazing. He even's able to succeed. He succeeds. He prospers. He has lots of stuff. He lives a life somewhat consistent with his own Proverbs and somewhat blatantly contradictory to his own Proverbs. Like, don't go down the pathway of the prostitute, which he egregiously violated a gazillion times. Look at now Ecclesiastes 2. There's this interesting, it's sandwiched between two sections in which he talks about wisdom and the emptiness of it and even the pain of it. In the middle, he says this, Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. I think what he's saying there is, look, I knew this, and I said, you know what, this is empty and even grievous. Let me try this way over here, which is pleasurable. And then he just talks about, I amassed for myself, and he talks about all his material things. I enlarged my works, verse 4. I built houses for myself, planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks and ponds of water. He had these private pools and all this, male and female slaves and homebound slaves, and possessed flocks and herds and silver and gold, male and female singers to play. I mean, he had his own YouTube right there in his kingdom, right? Anything he wanted at any moment. Became great, increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. God didn't take that wisdom away, despite all that pleasurable, hedonistic living. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold from my heart any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Verse 11, thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was what? Vanity, and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. There's the pleasure seeking. There's just full bore going for it. Comes back around now in verse 12 to the idea of wisdom. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness and folly. For what will man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? Listen to this. I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Whether you live your life in this world wisely or foolishly, you're still going to die, and everything's going. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? I mean, he doesn't even understand his own wisdom. What's the point? This too is vanity, he said to himself. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, and as much as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind. You remember how he ends the book of Ecclesiastes? Someone surely knows. He concludes with, fear God. Comes right back to that same phrase, which comes throughout Ecclesiastes just as much as it does throughout Proverbs. And all he can conclude is, fear God. But in his head, answer this question. Even his understanding of that, was it enough to really liberate him? It wasn't, was it? That is fascinating. And here's where it all comes together. It says of Solomon, he was wise beyond everyone else. It says of Jesus that he increased in wisdom over the course of his life. More and more and more and more, living as a man, growing in wisdom. It says of Christ that he was the beloved Son in whom God is well pleased. It says of Christ that he says to the Israelites, hey, this Gentile queen came to Solomon because she appreciated his wisdom, and yet one who is greater than Solomon is here, and yet no one listens to me. Jesus embodies God's wisdom, personifies it. He not only embodies the conveyance of God's wisdom to us, but he also fulfills wisdom for us, doesn't he? He lives the life of a perfectly wise man for the sake of fools, you and me, and Solomon. As Solomon demonstrates, wisdom by itself and even all the goods that can be attained through wisdom amount to emptiness and ultimately end in death. There is no transcendent meaning. If we don't see it, the whole point is God, the whole point is Christ. Yes, there are horizontals in this, just like now there are horizontals. But I would say the whole point that God includes, like the reason that those horizontal little gems and tidbits of wisdom here and there have value is because of the fact that they come from God and they're expressions of his character. And the God who has a certain immutable, fixed character created a world that functions according to that character. And yes, to some degree, you will benefit by living, just like if you jump off a 10-story building, you're going to fall and break something and probably die. There's some kind of earthly something to that, sure. But if we miss this, there's no point. And that's what God was teaching Solomon, what played out in his life. I don't have a problem saying, just like I can see at times in my past, okay, there's a certain sort of inclination toward God, but even in that, there's all this intermingled crazy lies and falsehoods and idolatry and selfishness and blinders and yet there's a God who loves, because of Christ, loves families down here, David's and yours. I don't know, to me that's pretty amazing. Oh yeah, no way. You don't write characters like this into the story. You don't write this kind of king into the story, David or Solomon or any of them. That's right. And maybe nobody's perfect. Maybe they've got little things here and there. But I mean, the type of flagrant, horrific stuff these guys are guilty of. What's this saying? From me, through me, to me are all things. To me belongs the glory forever. In our folly, God graciously draws our eyes to this, and it's from there that we understand wisdom of relational realities. All right, let's close in prayer. We got people coming in.